The epidemiologist who developed Victoria's roadmap out of lockdown has released modelling on the federal government's phased plan for reopening the international border. The modelling covers 240 different possible scenarios depending on the timing of the 4 phases of reopening and who and how many of us are vaccinated each stage. Melbourne University epidemiologist Professor Tony Blakely is the man behind the modelling. Tony Blakely, welcome back to Breakfast.
Yes, good morning.
I'm going to come to your new modelling in a moment, but Sydney's lockdown's been extended for another week. We're being told to expect a surge in cases today. How likely do you think it is that lockdown in Sydney will be able to lift in a week's time, given the way we're seeing it spread and the numbers we're seeing right now?
It is quite concerning. The number of cases they keep seeing out in the community with people who are not in isolation whilst they're all supposedly in lockdown, but people not in isolation, is very concerning. I'm also very concerned about the talk we're hearing that we're staying in lockdown until the end of this week and then we're coming out no matter what. I think that's rather naive, to be honest. This Delta variant, when you haven't got a lot of your population vaccinated, if you don't stamp it out and eliminate it, it's really difficult to live with it. This idea that we could just live with it now, it's going to be hard because they'll just be yo-yoing in and out of lockdown until they get the vaccination coverage north of 50%. So it is a very concerning situation at the moment in New South Wales.
Yeah, we seem to be getting slightly different soundings coming from the Health Minister out of frustration, I think, saying, well, and the Premier is saying she wants this to be the last lockdown. If this wants to be the last lockdown, do you think that how low are the numbers going to have to go, do you think, before New South Wales could lift it?
Right, so just be clear about this. So this is the last lockdown. It does unfortunately mean you have to eliminate it because it will just come back. How low do the numbers go? It's a really tricky one, but if I was the Chief Health Officer in Kerry Chant's shoes at the moment, I'd be wanting to see 0 cases that weren't in isolation or quarantine for a couple of days before letting go. If they let go when there's still a few cases occurring amongst people who are not yet in isolation or quarantine, you'd want to be back in your contact tracings. Just you're putting all your eggs in that basket. Maybe it's achievable, but it's quite a big ask with Delta. And with any COVID virus, it's highly stochastic or random, so you can get lucky and unlucky. So, yeah, it's pretty concerning what's happening in New South Wales at the moment.
Do you think the Sydney lockdown should be harder? Tony, during Melbourne's lockdown, there was that 5-kilometre limit on travel. Daycares were closed. Almost all shops were closed except for supermarkets and chemists and bottle shops. That's not where Sydney is at the moment.
Well, yeah, I don't really want to tell another state what to do, but since you asked, basically the harder the lockdown is, the quicker it is, as a general rule. Everything about COVID is a bit, chance and stochastic and all the rest of it. But as a general rule, if you want your lockdown to be short and effective, you do it as hard as you possibly can without, breaching human rights. If it could be harder, make it harder and try and get the damn thing over and done with.
I'm coming to your new modelling, but just one last question more broadly. There are 7 people under the age of 55 in ICU in Sydney right now with COVID. Does the body that advises the government on vaccination, ATAGI, does it need to revisit its advice on AstraZeneca and the risk-benefit for young people?
Okay, 2 things here. Even myself, when I heard that, I was quite taken aback that many people less than 55 are in ICU. It's a real reminder that this is just not a mild form of the flu. And the second thing is for ATAGI on AstraZeneca. I think the advice is now quite clear, and I'll restate my interpretation of it. If you want to get AstraZeneca and you are less than the age of 60, you can. Just ring up your GP, go and have a chat to them and get the AstraZeneca. It is doable. You are a citizen, you can make your own informed choice. Whilst we would prefer people less than 60 to have Pfizer, if Pfizer's not around and you've got a grandmother that you visit regularly and you want to get yourself protected, go and get AstraZeneca now.
Okay. Let's come to your modelling, which you're releasing today on the path out of the current way of life, basically with the Prime Minister's 4-phase plan for reopening the country in mind. The Prime Minister has a 4-phase plan. You've modelled 240 scenarios. What exactly, can you explain why so many, what you've been factoring in particularly?
Okay, so several things. First is that this idea that we just need to set a vaccination target. It's a great start to the conversation, but it's not the full conversation. And that's where you get to 240 scenarios. We need to think ahead to what the world looks like when we come to opening the borders up early next year. And the things that matter are how infectious the virus is. So we've got low and high infectivity, which is a lot more effective than it was last year. We've got three types of scenarios that we would use, whether we keep trying to keep the virus levels low, or we let it go a bit like Europe, or we really relax. We've got in there the vaccination coverage we get. Do we get to 50%, 60, 70, 80, 90%? Mm-hmm. And is that for just adults or kids as well? And once you get all those scenarios, you can compare them. And the way that I propose that we think about this is that we, rather than thinking about getting to 73% vaccination and we open up, or whatever the target might be, it's more about once all Australians have had the opportunity to be vaccinated, including children, I argue, but at least all adults have had the chance, we need to open up. And at that point, we then look at where we've got to with vaccination coverage, and we then change our border control policies and let people in at the risk that we can tolerate. So, for example, at about 70% vaccination coverage, our modelling suggests that you would open the borders up to people coming in quarantine-free. They're vaccinated, but they're coming in quarantine-free to countries that have infection rates about what Vietnam has now, so low to moderate infection rates. But if you just opened the borders up and we had the number of people coming in that was half the number pre-COVID, and they were coming in from countries that have infection rates like what Mexico has now or the UK has now, that will overwhelm our contact tracing and it'll get quite bad. Even at 70%, we open up under those conditions to countries like Vietnam. The virus will get in because it can even still come in on people who are vaccinated occasionally, and once it gets onto fertile soil, it will take off. So we will still need to adjust our risk acceptance. We would still be expecting something like a couple of thousand hospitalisations a year in a state the size of Victoria, 100 or so deaths a year, but at least we'd only be in lockdown less than 1 or 2 weeks on average.
Okay, so there's a few things there. There's changing our expectations, in a sense, to accepting 100 deaths a year, and that's bringing back the conversation, I suppose, about we've already factored in deaths from flu every year. It's changing that. But the 70% coverage, so you're saying that the government shouldn't look at the number of vaccinated Australians as the only guide. If we get to 70%, and let's hope we get there without too much of a roadblock, if we can get to that, then it's about managing how you manage people coming in from the borders and who you let in.
Exactly.
If we got to 90% vaccination, Tony, would you let other higher risk countries, people from the UK at the moment or people from Indonesia, is that the change?
Yeah, absolutely. If you get to 90%, it really changes the game. And so the incentive here is to get as many of us vaccinated as possible. So at 90%, you could not just throw the doors open and sort of stand aside, but you could let a lot more people in with the same sort of risk level of infection happening here as what it would have been at more conservative openings up at 70%. So, yeah, the higher we can get the vaccination coverage, the better it is. But we still have to, I think the way we have to approach this is think about the fact that when we open the borders up more fully, we need to have allowed ethically everybody to have had opportunity to be vaccinated, and then we dial the settings in based on what the vaccination coverage we have achieved is. Before we get to that massive point, we just open the doors, though, there are still some incremental things we can do. So, for example, the chance of people from China having the infection at the moment is near zero. So we could be, moving to a travel bubble or some form of modified home quarantine for people coming in from China quite soon. But what I'm really speaking to here is sort of that bigger opening up next year once we've had everybody the opportunity to be vaccinated.
And what sort of timelines are you talking about? Because you're talking about children being vaccinated for a start, because we know children are now getting and spread the Delta variant. I mean, this is that sort of change is going to slow down things for a start, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think there's two possible points at which we consider this more fulsome opening up. One is once all adults have had their chance to be vaccinated, which we hope will be this year. Personally, I think we should be allowing all children, the parents of children, the opportunity to be vaccinated before we do the fulsome opening up for several reasons. One is that for children, whilst their chance of getting sick with COVID is not that high, it's still enough of a chance there. And I think they need the option of considering getting vaccinated rather than just taking their chances. Second is kids are about 20-25%, depends which age cutoff you use of the population. They tend to hang out together in places called schools. And if we haven't vaccinated them, they will just be a fantastic place for the virus to spread and move around the community. So I do think we want to get at least 50% of kids vaccinated.
So just back on timeline, if the bottom line is availability of vaccine, there's a story in the Herald Sun today quoting pandemic analyst Kenneth Zhang, who's looked at the vaccine supply documents and saying there'll be enough to have 80% of the population vaccinated by Melbourne Cup Day. And basically, he's saying by Melbourne Cup Day, the nation will be a winner. What do you think of that timeline?
Oh, look, if we can pull it off, great. So I'm not beholden to what the date is, and the sooner we can do it, the better. The key thing is that everybody who wants to be vaccinated has had the opportunity to be vaccinated. I was assuming that we wouldn't quite be there by Melbourne Cup Day, is that by the end of the year, all adults would have at least had the chance to first vaccination. We could consider that fulsome opening up early in January. But I do think we need to allow at least 2 months for children to get vaccinated too.
Tony Blakely, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Hope that was useful.
Professor Tony Blakely, an epidemiologist from Melbourne University.